The winter of 1815 arrived not with frost, but with the rhythmic sound of wax seals breaking in a room that once smelled of cedar. Elara Thorne had learned the precise shape of being unseen long before the bailiffs arrived at her family's door. She had practiced it in the growing shadows of her father's mounting debts, moving through the grand corridors like a ghost in fraying silk. When Silas Thorne breathed his last in a mahogany chair already inventoried for auction, he left Elara with nothing but whispered secrets and a name that had lost its currency in polite society. The physicians called it a weakness of the heart, but Elara knew it was the weight of phantom debts that had finally stopped its beating. There was no time for the indulgence of grief. While creditors dismantled the house around her, stripping silk draperies and rolling up carpets, Elara's hands were busy. Her fingers were already beginning to take on the roughened texture of a woman who understood the mechanics of survival. She did not reach for the silver tea service, long sacrificed for annuities that vanished into the ether of Silas's bad investments. Instead, she reached behind the false panel in her father's study, seeking the ironwood ledger he had spoken of in hushed, frantic tones during his final days. She pressed the hidden latch, but found only an empty, dust-lined hollow. Whatever proof he had kept of the estate's hidden assets had been moved, likely taken to the one place he had sworn to protect: Oakshott Manor, where he had once served as steward. She packed her remaining threadbare linens into a small wooden crate, the absence of the ledger echoing in her chest. The journey to Oakshott Manor was an agonizing progression through the freezing mud of late November. Elara traveled alone atop a common agricultural cart piled with the meager belongings the law permitted her. Behind her, a crate held the only other assets she had salvaged: 10 hens and a single rooster with frost-nipped feathers. To the creditors who picked her home bare, the birds were beneath notice. To Elara, they were the difference between slow starvation and the dignity of a morning task. They were living things relying on her competence, a routine to keep her mind from shattering. As the familiar landmarks of her childhood receded into the biting grey mist, she focused fiercely on the heavy weight of the rough canvas grain satchel at her feet, bracing herself for the indignity of charity. As the cart crossed the Vane estate boundary, the landscape changed. Bare, twisted branches interlocked overhead, like the vaulted stone ceiling of an ancient cathedral, casting skeletal shadows across the rutted road. A heavy stillness lingered here, a quality of air undisturbed by ordinary men. Oakshott was the seat of Gideon Vane, a man spoken of in the village only in hushed tones. They called him the Scarred Recluse, a powerful duke who had retreated from the world following an unspoken tragedy. Silas had once managed the Vane family's wealth, and through an old obligation, a position had been offered to his daughter, not in the drawing room, but in the unseen servitude of the house. The cart was intercepted at the towering wrought-iron secondary gates by a lone rider draped in charcoal velvet. Lady Honoria Blackwood, the Duke's cousin and the self-appointed mistress of Oakshott's social order, looked down at Elara with a gaze that held the chill of a mountain stream. She gestured sharply with her riding crop to a bundle held by a footman. "You are the Thorne girl," Lady Honoria said, her voice dripping with an aristocratic boredom that barely concealed her malice. "I suppose you expect to find a cozy cottage waiting for you, out of some misplaced sense of familial loyalty. You should disabuse yourself of such notions. You are here because we require someone to manage the poultry yard, a muddy task our regular staff quite rightly finds beneath them. It is fitting labor for a family that has fallen so utterly far from grace." She signaled the footman to toss a bundle of fabric into Elara's lap. "This was a sarcenet gown of mine. It is ruined at the hem, the silk is torn, and the sleeves are hopelessly frayed. But it is far more than you deserve. You will wear it for your daily chores. It will serve as a constant reminder of the status you no longer possess." Elara took the sarcenet gown, her roughened fingers grazing the fine silk that had been intentionally stained with black ink at the cuffs, to ensure it could never be worn in polite company. She did not look away from Honoria's icy stare, refusing to grant the older woman the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "I understand my duties perfectly, Lady Honoria. I shall ensure the birds are well tended, and the yard is kept to the highest standard." Honoria's lip curled in a display of sharp, dry wit, though her eyes remained entirely devoid of warmth. "See that you do. You will be housed in the north attic of the servants' wing. Stay away from the main galleries, and under no circumstances are you ever to cross into the west wing. The Duke has no patience for penury wandering his halls, and I will not have my peace disturbed by your ragged presence." The servant quarters of Oakshott Manor were a dizzying labyrinth of narrow, drafty corridors and steep limestone stairs that seemed to sweat moisture in the relentless damp weather. Elara's assigned room was a mere cell tucked under the eaves, smelling of old, wet wool, crumbling plaster, and the faint scent of tallow candles. From her grime-streaked window she could peer down and see the poultry yard below, a muddy, neglected rectangle of frozen earth situated directly beneath the imposing west wing. High above the yard, the great arched windows of the Duke's private library loomed like the unblinking eyes of a silent sentinel, reflecting the steely grey sky. As Elara unpacked, laying her sparse linens carefully over the hard straw pallet, a sharp knock sounded at the heavy oak door. Standing there was a woman with a face as deeply lined as a dried plum and shrewd, assessing eyes. This was Martha Higgins, the formidable estate cook, holding a small pewter plate. "You're the Thorne girl, then?" Mrs. Higgins said, her voice sounding much like the heavy grinding of millstones. She stepped boldly into the tiny room, her critical gaze sweeping over the meager wooden crate and lingering on Elara's frost-bitten fingers. "You look like you have never held anything heavier than a silver spoon. But this house doesn't care for long names, only for hard work. The poultry yard is an absolute mess, the wooden fences are rotting, and the birds are half-starved. I hope you have the spine for it, because no one here will do the work for you." Elara straightened her aching back, her calloused hands resting protectively on the rough canvas of the grain satchel. "I can work, Mrs. Higgins. My father taught me long ago that the true value of a thing is found in its careful maintenance, not its original price. I will have the yard in order by week's end, and the birds will thrive under my care." Martha let out a short, dry sound of amusement, though the lines around her eyes softened fractionally. Platitudes and pretty words do not fill an empty belly. Eat this tough, salt pork while it's warm. But listen to me carefully, girl. This house has ears in the walls, and it certainly has eyes. The Duke, he watches. He has not spoken a single word to anyone but his valet in 5 years. But he sees absolutely everything from that high library window. You keep your head down. Do not wander where you aren't explicitly invited. And for heaven's sake, keep those birds from squawking too loud when the sun rises, or he will have them all slaughtered for the sheer noise. Elara looked toward the small window, her gaze drifting toward the dark, silent mass of the west wing across the yard. "I have no intention of disturbing His Grace. I only want to survive this bitter winter, Mrs. Higgins, and do the physical work I was sent here to do. Survival is a harsh, unforgiving master in Oakshott," Martha replied quietly, turning to leave. "Do not go looking for the master, and he might just forget you are here entirely. That is the best a girl with your ruined history can ever hope for." The next morning, before the weak winter sun had even cleared the jagged limestone ridge, Elara was out in the yard. The heavy frost on the overgrown grass crunched sharply under the soles of her thin boots. She wore the sarcenet gown, the once luxurious silk rasping loudly against the cold morning air. She had spent half the night mending the frayed hem with a sturdy invisible stitch that Lady Honoria could never master. She moved with a quiet, efficient grace, chipping the ice from the cracked water troughs, repairing the broken iron latches of the wooden coop, and scattering the golden feed evenly from her satchel. She was actively learning the language of the birds, and the simple, profound satisfaction of a physical task completed with absolute precision. She did not look up at the towering facade of the manor house, but she could acutely feel the heavy weight of a gaze upon her, as tangible and piercing as the frost on her skin. High above, standing perfectly still in the deep shadow of the great library window, a tall figure remained motionless behind the thick glass. Gideon Vane watched the lone girl working in the muddy yard. He saw the precise way she handled the rough canvas grain sack, the way she moved with a quiet dignity that her lowly station no longer required. He observed how she was systematically reclaiming the neglected space through sheer, unyielding labor. Every morning, she would return to the yard to meticulously feed the chickens, her breath blooming in soft white plumes against the vast grey stone of the manor walls. And every day, the silent Duke would remain at his post, witnessing a rhythmic labor that felt far more substantial than the shallow social posturing of his cousin. Elara Thorne had no idea she was the only bright point of light in his suffocating world of absolute grey stone. It was the exact temperature of silence that defined his life. Yet as he watched her calloused hands mend the broken things of his estate, the impenetrable coldness of his isolation began to feel like a wall that might one day be dismantled, stone by stone. The second morning at Oakshott Manor began before the light had even begun to bleed into the horizon, announced only by the biting, damp chill that seeped through the attic's singular, drafty window. Elara Thorne awoke not to the soft chime of a bedside clock or the hushed entry of a personal maid, but to the sharp metallic cold that seemed to settle in the very marrow of her bones. She lay still for a moment on the hard straw pallet, listening to the rhythmic whistling of the wind beneath the eaves, a sound that echoed the hollowness in her chest, where her father's secret still vibrated like an unplayed string. She reached for the pile of clothes at the foot of her bed, her fingers brushing the stiff, rustling fabric of the ink-stained sarcenet gown. It was a garment intended by Lady Honoria to be a shroud for her dignity. Yet as Elara pulled it over her shift, she felt only the familiar, grounding weight of a uniform. Descending the back stairs was a feat of memory and tactile navigation, the limestone steps slick with a condensation that smelled of ancient stone and forgotten winters. By the time she reached the heavy oak door leading to the service yard, the world was a study in monochromatic greys. The poultry yard was a desolate, muddy square, its fences leaning at weary angles as if exhausted by the relentless northern rain. Elara took a deep breath, the air sharp and metallic, and reached for the heavy-grained satchel hanging by the door. The rough canvas was cold to the touch, the weight of the golden oats and cracked corn inside providing a momentary, stabilizing anchor to the earth. She moved into the yard with a steady, purposeful gait, the mud sucking at her thin leather boots with a persistent, rhythmic squelch. The chickens, a motley collection of ruffled feathers and sharp, expectant eyes, began to stir within the coop. They were the only beings at Oakshott who did not care for her family's ruin or the ink stains on her cuffs. To them, she was simply the bringer of life, the steady hand in a world of frost. As she unlatched the door, the copper-feathered rooster stepped out with a suspicious tilt of his head, his golden eye catching the first faint shimmer of dawn. Elara began her work, her movements economical and precise, scattering the feed in wide, silver-tinted arcs across the frozen ground. It was in the middle of this humble ritual that she felt it, the weight of a gaze so heavy it seemed to press against the back of her neck like a physical touch. She did not startle. She had spent a lifetime learning how to be observed without acknowledging the observer. Instead, she continued her task, her calloused hands moving with the steady grace of a weaver at a loom. High above, in the darkened silhouette of the library window, the Duke remained a motionless shadow. She knew Gideon Vane was there, a silent sentinel in a room filled with the scent of old leather and stagnant grief. Mrs. Higgins had warned her that the Duke saw everything, and as she stood in the center of the muddy yard, Elara realized that for the first time in many months, she was being witnessed not as a tragedy, but as a worker. The silence between the yard and the library window was not empty. It had a specific density, a quality of shared air that felt more honest than any ballroom conversation she had ever endured. She began to notice the small details of the coop that required her attention, a loose slat near the base, a hinge that groaned with the weight of rust, and the way the thatch on the roof had begun to thin. These were the bones of the thing, the structural truths that could not be hidden by aristocratic pretense. As the sun began to lift a pale, watery light over the stone ramparts, Elara found a discarded piece of timber near the fence. She did not have a hammer, but she found a heavy, flat stone and began to drive a protruding nail back into the wood with a series of dull, rhythmic thuds. The sound echoed through the quiet morning, a declaration of intent that she knew traveled all the way up to that high, silent window. She focused on the repair with a meditative intensity, her fingers tracing the rough grain of the wood, feeling for the rot that threatened the stability of the structure. The wood was soft with damp, the fibers yielding slightly under her pressure, yet there was a deep satisfaction in the labor. She spent nearly an hour mending the slats, her breath blooming in white plumes as she worked to ensure the safety of the creatures under her care. She thought of her father, Silas Thorne, and the meticulous care he had once taken with the great ledgers of the estate. He had taught her that a foundation is not merely stone, but the integrity of the smallest tasks. Every strike of the stone against the nail was a tribute to his memory, a refusal to let the world break her as it had broken him. The morning grew bolder, the grey mist beginning to swirl in the rising wind, when the heavy crunch of gravel announced a disturbance in the quiet order of the yard. A small, elegant pony trap, polished to a high, cruel shine, rounded the corner of the stables. At the reins sat Lady Honoria Blackwood, her charcoal riding habit appearing almost black against the pale morning light. She pulled the pony to a sharp, jarring halt just outside the poultry fence, the animal's breath huffing in great white clouds. Honoria did not descend. She sat perched in the trap like a bird of prey, her gaze raking over Elara's mud-splattered hem and the way her hair had begun to escape its pins in the damp air. "I see the Thorne daughter has found her level at last," Lady Honoria said, her voice carrying across the yard with the crystalline sharpness of breaking ice. She didn't look at Elara's face, but rather at the sarcenet gown, her lip curling as she noted the invisible mending at the hem. "I had wondered if you would have the sense to burn that rag, but it seems you lack even the most basic vanity. It is a pity. My maid thought it might at least serve as a floorcloth, but I see you have chosen to wear your shame instead." Elara did not stop her work. She was kneeling in the mud, her fingers tracing the grain of a broken fence post, assessing the rot. She waited until the silence had stretched to the point of discomfort before she looked up, her expression a mask of quiet, impenetrable composure. "Vanity is a luxury of the idle, Lady Honoria. This gown is sturdy enough for the labor required of me. As for the ink, it reminds me that even a stain can be worn with a straight back." Honoria's eyes narrowed, the grip on her riding crop tightening until her knuckles turned white. "Labor. You speak of it as if it were a virtue, rather than a sentence. Do not think that mucking about with birds will earn you favor in this house. The Duke has no interest in your performance of humility. He values efficiency, and he values silence. If I find the poultry yard wanting by the time the frost breaks, you will find yourself on the road to the desolate moors of the north with nothing but your chickens for company." "The yard will be maintained," Elara replied, her voice low and steady, a direct contrast to the sharp, nervous energy radiating from the woman in the trap. "And the Duke, I believe, is perfectly capable of discerning the difference between a performance and a task well done. Perhaps you should worry less about my hem and more about the damp in the West Wing stables. The horses are coughing, and the drainage is poorly managed." The audacity of the observation caused Honoria to gasp, a small, undignified sound that was immediately swallowed by the wind. She signaled the pony forward with a violent flick of the reins, the trap jerking away and spraying a fine mist of cold mud across the front of Elara's gown. Elara Thorne did not flinch. She stood slowly, wiping her dirt-stained hands on her apron, and looked back up toward the library window. The shadow was still there. Gideon Vane had seen the entire exchange. He had witnessed the calculated insult and the quiet defiance, and for a fleeting second, Elara thought she saw a slight shift in the silhouette, a tilt of the head, a movement of a hand against the glass, before the figure vanished into the deep gloom of the room behind him. The encounter left a lingering tension in the air, a metallic aftertaste that made the simple act of breathing feel like a challenge. Elara returned to the coupe, her heart thudding a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. She was not afraid of Honoria's threats, but she was acutely aware of the fragility of her position. Every action she took was a gamble, a stone placed in a wall that had no mortar. She began to clean the water troughs, the ice-cold water numbing her fingers until they felt like senseless wooden pegs. Yet as she worked, a strange sense of peace began to settle over her. There was a dignity in the manual labor that no amount of aristocratic shaming could touch. Each trough scrubbed, each slat secured, was a small victory over the chaos of her father's death and the cruelty of her current surroundings. Later that morning, as the sun finally managed to pierce the heavy shroud of clouds with a few weak, golden needles, Mrs. Higgins appeared at the edge of the yard, her sturdy frame wrapped in a thick wool shawl that smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. She stood for a moment, watching Elara as she carefully moved a heavy bale of straw toward the coop, her face set in a grimace of concentration. The cook's expression was unreadable, a map of deep lines and hidden sympathies that she guarded as fiercely as her pantry keys. "You've a stubborn streak in you, girl," Martha Higgins said, her voice sounding less like a grindstone and more like a warm hearth. She stepped into the yard, her boots making heavy, decisive thuds in the mud. "I saw the lady's trap. She has a way of leaving a chill behind her that even a summer sun can't burn off. You shouldn't have answered her back. In this house, the invisible survive longest." Elara paused, leaning against the wooden fence to catch her breath, her chest heaving slightly. "I have spent my life being invisible, Mrs. Higgins. It did not save my father, and it will not save me now. If I am to be a servant, I will be a competent one. Lady Honoria respects nothing but power, and since I have none, I will give her the truth instead. It is the only thing she cannot buy." Martha let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh, the first genuine sound of amusement Elara had heard since arriving at Oakshott. Truth is a dangerous currency to spend in a duke's house, especially one as quiet as this. But I suppose if you're going to be a fool, you might as well be a brave one. Come inside when you're finished. There's a pot of tea on the hob, and some bread that isn't entirely like a brick. And mind you, don't track that mud onto my clean floor, or you'll find out that my temper is far worse than the Duke's silence. As Mrs. Higgins turned back toward the kitchen, Elara took a final look at the west wing. The library window was empty now, the glass reflecting only the pale, shifting clouds. But as she turned to follow the cook, her eyes caught something on the ground near the boundary fence, a small, dark object that hadn't been there when she started her chores. She walked over and knelt in the mud, her breath catching in her throat. It was a heavy iron key, old and slightly rusted, resting on a flat stone, as if it had been placed there with deliberate care. There was no note, no explanation, but as she picked it up, the cold metal felt like a promise. It was not a key to the front door, nor was it a key to a jewelry box. It was a key to a ledger, or perhaps a heart, and as she tucked it into the hidden pocket of the sarcenet gown, Elara Thorne felt the first faint warmth of hope begin to stir in the cold silence of her new world. The silent Duke was no longer just watching. He was reaching out through the stillness, and for the first time, her lifelong habit of going unnoticed had finally begun to crack. In the cold, elegant silence of Oakshott Manor, a new foundation was being laid, not in the drawing rooms or the ballrooms, but in the muddy yard where the estate's very core was finally being mended. Where are you listening from tonight? And have you ever found strength in a task others deem small? Let me know in the comments below. Midnight was a tempest of unreason, a violent unraveling of the world that began with the shrieking of wind through the limestone crevices of the north attic. Elara Thorne lay awake, her breath held in the freezing dark, listening to the house groan under the assault of a northern gale. It was not the rattling of the casements that chilled her, nor the way the old oak beams of the manor seemed to weep under the pressure of the rain. It was the sound of splintering wood from the yard below. It was a sharp, final crack, the sound of a sanctuary breaking, that sent her heart into a frantic, uneven rhythm. She thought of her birds, those small, copper-feathered lives that were the only things she truly possessed in this cold, grey wilderness. She thought of the wooden coop she had so painstakingly mended with a heavy stone and rusted nails, and she knew with the weary certainty of the dispossessed that the storm had made a mockery of her labor. She did not wait for the dawn. Wrapping her thin wool shawl over the sarcenet gown, she descended the service stairs in the pitch black, her bare feet finding the familiar worn hollows of the limestone steps. The back door resisted her, the wind howling against the heavy oak, as if it were a physical hand trying to keep her inside, but she threw her shoulder against the wood with a desperate, focused strength. When she finally broke through, the rain hit her like a volley of iron filings, cold and sharp enough to draw blood. The poultry yard was a chaotic blur of mud and silver-black water. In the center of the yard, the coop lay like a ribcage picked clean by the wind, the roof torn half away, and the fence posts leaning at impossible jagged angles. The birds were huddling in the wreckage, a sodden mass of terrified feathers and low, mournful clucking. Elara fell to her knees in the mud, her fingers searching through the splintered timber for the survivors. The once fine silk of her gown was soon heavy with filth, the ink-stained cuffs dragging through the sludge as she worked to gather the creatures into the one corner of the structure that still held its integrity. She felt a sharp, burning slice across her palm as a jagged piece of wood caught her, but she ignored the warmth of the blood mixing with the icy rain. She was back in the world of her father's ledgers, a world where one must act out for every loss, where a missing entry could mean the collapse of an entire foundation. She would not lose a single life tonight. She would not allow the storm to finish what Lady Honoria's cruelty had started. As the first bruised light of dawn began to bleed through the clouds, the rain settled into a relentless grey drizzle. Elara was still in the yard, her hair plastered to her skull and her skin the color of wet parchment. She had found a discarded length of heavy canvas and was attempting to lash it over the exposed roof of the coop. Her hands were clumsy with cold, her knuckles swollen and blue, yet she moved with a methodical, stubborn precision that bordered on the religious. She hauled a fallen beam toward the center of the ruin, her muscles screaming under the weight, and began to shore up the sagging fence. She did not look up toward the west wing. She did not check to see if the silent observer was at his post. She simply worked, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that clouded the air before her. High above, behind the thick glass of the library window, Gideon Vane stood as if carved from the very stone of the manor. He had been there all night, a ghost in a charcoal frock coat, watching the girl battle the elements. He had seen her emerge in the midnight fury, a small, dark shape against the immense violence of the storm. He had watched her hands, those calloused, capable hands, pull the terrified birds from the wreckage. He saw the precise moment the wind had tried to knock her down, and the way she had simply leaned harder into the gale, her sarcenet gown clinging to her like a second ruined skin. He saw the blood on her palm, a dark smudge against the grey mud, and for the first time in 5 years, the heavy, suffocating silence of his heart was pierced by a sharp, agonizing chord of recognition. It was not pity that he felt, but a profound, terrifying respect. He had lived his life behind the armor of his status and the walls of his grief, but this girl, this daughter of a disgraced steward, was building a world out of nothing but mud and splinters. By the time the sun had fully risen, a weak and watery eye in a leaden sky, Elara had secured the canvas. She stood in the center of the yard, her head bowed and her shoulders trembling with exhaustion. She looked utterly broken, a figure of penury and ruin, yet the yard was quiet. The birds were safe. She had held back the chaos with nothing but her own 2 hands and a will that refused to be unseen. Gideon turned away from the window, his movements slow and deliberate. The room behind him was filled with the scent of beeswax and the dry, intellectual dust of 1,000 books, a world of theory and legacy that felt suddenly, sharply irrelevant. He walked to the heavy mahogany desk where the estate ledgers lay open, the ink dry on records of land and lineage. He did not reach for his pen. Instead, he reached for a small, iron-bound chest kept in the shadows of the lower shelves. He opened it with a key that hung on a chain around his neck, revealing not gold but a collection of specialized carpentry tools, chisels of fine steel, a balanced mallet of heavy boxwood, and a small razor-sharp saw. They had belonged to his grandfather, a man who believed that a duke should know the bones of his own house. A few hours later, after the manor had begun to stir with the quiet, muffled movements of the staff, Elara returned to the yard. She had spent a brief, restless hour in the kitchen, where Mrs. Higgins had forced a bowl of hot, thin porridge into her hands without a single word of comfort. She was sore in every joint, her body feeling like a clock whose gears had been stripped by a heavy hand. She walked toward the boundary fence where the mud was deepest, intending to check the drainage she had mentioned to Lady Honoria, when she stopped dead. There, resting on the flat stone where the iron key had been found the day before, sat a sturdy oilcloth-wrapped bundle. Beside it stood a large, heavy sack of grain, not the common dusty sweepings she had been given, but premium oats and sunflower seeds, the kind reserved for the finest stables. Elara knelt, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pulled back the oilcloth to reveal the tools. The steel of the chisels gleamed with a cold blue light, and the mallet felt perfectly balanced in her hand, the wood smooth and warm despite the morning damp. There was no note, but tucked into the handle of the saw was a small, clean scrap of parchment. On it was written a single word in a heavy, archaic hand: mend. She looked up, her gaze flying toward the West Wing library. For the first time, the window was not a dark mirror reflecting the sky. The heavy velvet curtains had been pulled wide, and the glass caught the weak morning light. Gideon Vane was standing on the narrow stone balcony outside the library, his tall figure framed by the arched doorway. He was not a shadow today. He was a man in the world. He did not speak, and he did not move toward her, but as their eyes met across the muddy expanse of the yard, he slowly, almost imperceptibly, inclined his head. It was a gesture of acknowledgement that felt more substantial than a king's decree. He was not looking at her as a servant, nor as a curiosity of penury. He was looking at her as a peer in the labor of restoration. Elara felt a strange, terrifying warmth bloom in her chest, a heat that had nothing to do with the sun, and everything to do with the weight of the iron key still tucked into her pocket. She reached out and touched the fine steel of the new tools, the texture of the metal a stark contrast to the rough, splintered wood of the ruin she had to rebuild. She understood now. The key was for the secrets of the house, but the tools were for the secrets of the soul. She stood, her back straightening until she felt the line of her spine become a pillar of resolve. She took the grain satchel and began her morning ritual, her movements no longer just a task of survival, but a ceremony of belonging. As she scattered the premium oats, the copper-feathered rooster let out a triumphant, golden cry that seemed to shatter the lingering grey silence of the storm. High above, the Duke remained on his balcony, a silent sentinel who was no longer just watching a girl feed chickens, but witnessing the slow, meticulous reconstruction of a legacy that had once been lost to the frost. "Where are you listening from tonight? And have you ever found that the most valuable sandwiches are the ones that acknowledge your strength rather than your need? Tell me about a time someone truly saw the labor of your hands in the comments below." The residue of the storm lingered in the air, a scent of bruised earth and sharp pine resin that seemed to coat the back of Elara Thorne's throat as she returned to the yard. The morning was an exercise in silver and slate, the sky a vast sheet of grey that offered no warmth, only the clinical clarity of a world scrubbed clean. Elara moved with a stiffness that was a direct tax on her midnight labours. Her muscles felt like overextended bowstrings, and the cut on her palm throbbed with a rhythmic, dull heat. Yet, as she approached the flat stone near the boundary fence, the sight of the oilcloth-wrapped tools and the heavy sack of premium grain acted as a balm far more potent than any salve Mrs. Higgins could provide. She knelt in the damp mud, her fingers tracing the heavy canvas of the grain sack. She noted the richness of the oats spilling from the tie, plump, golden, and smelling of sun-drenched fields far removed from the cold shadows of Oakshott. She did not immediately take the tools back to her attic room. Instead, she carried the oilcloth bundle into the kitchen, the warmth of the roaring hearth hitting her like a physical wave. The room was a cacophony of domestic industry, the rhythmic thud of a knife against a chopping block and the aromatic steam of a beef ragout beginning its long simmer. Martha Higgins stood at the center of the chaos, her sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms as sturdy as oak branches. She paused her stirring of a copper pot as Elara entered, her shrewd eyes dropping to the bundle in the girl's arms and then to the lingering traces of mud on the ink-stained sarcenet gown. "You've been out in the yard again," Mrs. Higgins remarked, her voice a low rumble. She gestured toward a wooden stool near the hearth. "Sit. You look like you've been dragged through a hedge. I've a pot of tea that's been steeping long enough to tan leather, which is likely the only thing that will put the blood back in your cheeks." Elara sat, the heat of the fire beginning to prickle against her chilled skin. She placed the tools on her lap, the weight of the steel chisels and the boxwood mallet, a grounding presence. "The Duke left these for me, Mrs. Higgins." At the boundary fence, along with grain that isn't half composed of dust, the kitchen grew suddenly quiet. Scullery maids shifted their gaze away, their hands moving faster, as if the mere mention of the Duke's name were a summons. Martha Higgins didn't flinch, but the lines around her mouth deepened. She poured a mug of tea, thick, dark, and smelling of wood smoke, and handed it to Elara with a steady hand. "He hasn't spoken a word since the Great Frost 5 years ago," Martha said, her voice dropping to a register that suggested a confidence being shared in a cathedral. "Not to his cousin, not to the solicitors, not even to the king. People think silence is a void, girl, but in this house, it's a weight. After the tragedy with his sister, the betrayal of the Thorne who came before you, though I shouldn't speak ill of the dead, His Grace simply closed the door on his voice." Elara took a cautious sip of the tea. "And yet he watches. He watches from the library, as if he were waiting for something to break." "He isn't waiting for something to break," Martha corrected quietly, her gaze fixing on the steel chisels. "He's waiting for something to be mended. He sees you out there, Elara. He sees the way you don't complain about the sarcenet or the mud. You're the first thing in 5 years that's moved in that yard without asking for something from him. Don't go thinking his silence means he's empty. It means he's listening for the water, not the wheel." Elara looked down at her calloused hands, the skin around the cut on her palm already beginning to tighten as it healed. "Then perhaps I shall give him something worth listening to." When she returned to the poultry yard an hour later, the tools were tucked into the large pockets she had sewn into her gown, and the grain satchel was slung over her shoulder. The birds were waiting, their clucking a tapestry of sound that filled the morning. She began her ritual, scattering the premium oats with a wide, rhythmic swing of her arm. Today she did not work in focused silence. As she moved between the hens, her boots squelching in the recovering mud, she began to speak. "The wind is from the north today," she murmured, her voice carrying easily in the still air. She was looking directly at the copper-feathered rooster. "It smells of salt and old stone. My father always said that a northern wind was a test of joinery. If the wood doesn't groan, it isn't breathing." She knew the dark silhouette was behind the glass of the high library window. She did not look up. She spoke to the chickens as if they were her confidants, detailing the precise weight of the boxwood mallet she had been gifted, and the way the steel of the chisels felt like frozen lightning against her skin. "It is a curious thing to find a tool that fits the hand so perfectly," Elara continued, her voice steady and meditative, as if the man who made it understood the specific requirements of the timber. "This mallet has a balance that suggests it was meant for more than just mending fences. It was meant for the bones of a house." She was speaking to the silence of the West Wing, filling the void Martha had described with the ordinary truths of her labor. She told the birds about the ironwood ledger her father had lost, and the way the ink on her cuffs reminded her of the ledgers she used to balance when her world was still made of silk. She was talking aloud to herself, yet she was also crafting a bridge made of sound. The silence was changing. She was no longer a ghost, but a voice, and she could feel the searching gaze of Gideon Vane following every word. By the afternoon, the grey slate of the sky had begun to fracture, allowing watery shafts of light to illuminate the corners of the estate. Elara turned her attention to the small, cottage-like structure that served as the primary poultry house. The storm had compromised the shingles of the roof, and the wood beneath was soft with the threat of rot. She set her toolbox on the flat stone and began the meticulous work of restoration. She used the new saw to cut away the blackened, damp wood of the eaves, the sound a sharp, rhythmic rasp that echoed against the stone walls. The smell of fresh pine shavings began to mask the scent of the mud, a clean perfume of progress. She used the chisels to clean the joints, the steel slicing through the timber with a buttery precision. She was not merely fixing a roof, she was rebuilding a foundation, one stroke at a time. As she worked, she lost the sense of time. The world narrowed to the grain of the wood and the satisfying thud of the mallet as she drove the new pegs into place. She was kneeling on the roof of the small structure, her sarcenet gown tucked around her knees, her hair having escaped its pins to hang in a dark curtain around her face. There was a grace in her movements that rivaled any dancer in a London ballroom. The silence of the yard was suddenly underscored by a sense of presence. Elara froze, her mallet raised in midair. She did not look toward the ground, but tilted her head up toward the west wing. There, Gideon Vane stood upon the high library balcony, his charcoal frock coat appearing almost black against the pale sunlight. He was a sentinel of restrained grief, his hands gripping the stone railing as he looked down at her. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to stand in the sun, yet his posture was one of intense, unwavering focus. He did not speak. He simply watched. He watched the way Elara held the chisel, and the way her calloused fingers moved with tenderness over the grain. He was witnessing the labor of her hands from his high fortress, and for a long moment their eyes met across the distance. Elara did not curtsy. She did not apologize for the dirt on her face. She simply looked at him, her mallet still in her hand, and gave him a short, decisive nod. Gideon Vane remained motionless for a long moment, the wind pulling at the hem of his coat. Then, he stepped back into the shadows of the library and vanished into the gloom of the manor. Elara climbed down from the roof, her heart a steady drum in the quiet afternoon. As she approached the flat stone to retrieve her oilcloth, she stopped. Glinting in a stray beam of light sat a small brass compass she had not noticed before. It was an instrument of navigation, a tool for finding one's way in a world that had lost its map. She felt the cool weight of it in her palm, the brass warming quickly against her skin. She looked up at the library window, which was once again a dark, unblinking eye, but she knew that the observer was no longer just watching. He was moving toward her through the silence, one gesture at a time. The worthless girl in the ruined silk had become the only person in Oakshott Manor who could see, through the Duke's silence, to the man who was waiting to be found. The heavy, expectant quiet of the estate no longer felt like a hollow void, but like a house that had finally found its foundation again. Where are you listening from tonight? And have you ever found that a gift of trust is more valuable than any gold? Tell me about a person who recognized your worth through your work in the comments below. The fragile peace of the morning was shattered, not by a storm of the elements, but by the rhythmic, grinding crunch of iron-rimmed wheels against the wet gravel of the manor drive. Elara Thorne, still kneeling by the poultry house with the brass compass warming the palm of her hand, felt the vibration through the very soles of her boots. It was a sharp, intrusive sound that didn't belong to the rhythmic labor of the yard. She stood slowly, her spine stiffening into a pillar of wary reserve, and tucked the compass into the hidden pocket of her sarcenet gown, right beside the heavy iron key. The morning air, which had briefly smelled of fresh pine and hope, was suddenly choked by the cloying, artificial scent of lavender water and expensive leather as Lady Honoria Blackwood's carriage rounded the corner of the stables. This was not the small pony trap Lady Honoria favoured for her morning jaunts. This was a black lacquered gig, pulled by two high-stepping chestnuts that tossed their heads in irritation at the muddy terrain. Honoria sat perched on the velvet seat, her charcoal velvet pelisse trimmed with silver fox fur, appearing like a dark, elegant inkblot against the pale limestone of the manor. Behind the carriage followed two footmen in the vain livery, their faces set in the mask of unthinking obedience that usually preceded an act of social cruelty. As the gig lurched to a halt, Honoria did not wait for assistance. She looked down at Elara with a gaze that held the clinical coldness of a winter sea, her lips curved in a smile that was entirely devoid of light. "I see you have been busy, Elara," Honoria said, her voice a sharp, crystalline strike against the morning quiet. She gestured with a gloved hand toward the mended roof of the poultry house, where the fresh pine shavings still glistened with dampness. A remarkable display of peasant industry. It is a pity that such effort has been spent on a foundation that is no longer yours to occupy. I suppose the daughter of a steward would naturally find comfort in the dirt, but the time for your performance of loyalty has come to an end. Elara Thorne did not move. She felt the weight of the specialized carpentry tools in her pockets, a secret armor that Honoria could not see. "The yard is well tended, Lady Honoria, and the birds are thriving. I have fulfilled every duty requested of me and more. If you have come to inspect the drainage, I can show you the work I have completed on the west wing perimeter." Honoria let out a short, dry sound of amusement that was more a bark than a laugh. She reached into a small silk reticule at her side and produced a folded sheet of heavy parchment, the red wax seal already broken and hanging like a drop of dried blood. "I have not come for an inspection of your muddy triumphs. I have come to deliver a finality. It seems your father's debts were far more extensive than even the solicitors realized." Silas Thorne did not merely lose his own estate. He left a trail of unpaid annuities and forged ledgers that reach into the very heart of the Vane holdings. This notice of eviction is a matter of legal perpetuity. You are to be removed from Oakshott property immediately, as the Thorne name is no longer a debt we choose to carry. The mention of her father as a forger sent a flare of cold heat through Elara's chest, but she kept her hands steady at her sides. Because she had already discovered the ironwood ledger hidden beneath the floorboards, she knew the exact shape of Honoria's lie. "My father was a meticulous man, Lady Honoria. He was a steward of integrity. If there are debts, there is a record that proves the contrary, the ironwood ledger, which documents every transaction of this estate with absolute precision. I have seen the truth of those records, and they do not speak of forgery or theft. They speak of a Thorne's loyalty, which has been repaid with calculated insults." "It is a legal reality," Honoria snapped, the silver fox fur at her throat trembling with her sudden sharp movement. She signaled to the two footmen, who stepped forward into the mud of the yard. "I will not have the peace of this estate disturbed by the daughter of a thief any longer. Take her crate of belongings to the boundary gate. And as for these birds, they are a nuisance and a distraction. Drive them away. If they wish to remain in the mud, they can do so without the benefit of a Thorne's charity." The footmen hesitated for a fraction of a second, their eyes flickering toward the high windows of the west wing, but Honoria's sharp command brooked no delay. One of them stepped toward the poultry house, his heavy boot kicking over the grain satchel Elara had left by the door. The premium oats, Gideon's gift, spilled out across the wet ground in a golden, wasteful arc. The chickens erupted in a panicked flurry of feathers and sharp, terrified clucking as the man began to tear at the canvas. Elara had so carefully lashed over the roof during the storm. It was a violent, senseless undoing of her labor, the sound of the ripping fabric echoing like a physical blow in the silent yard. Elara stepped forward, her hand reaching for the mallet in her pocket, her heart pounding with a fierce, protective rage. "Stop this! This labor was performed for the Duke's estate, not for your spite. You have no right to destroy what has been mended." "I have every right to purge this house of rot," Honoria replied, her voice rising in a rare moment of undignified heat. "Disperse the birds," I said. "Let them find their own way in the moors." The footman reached for the latch of the coop, his hand closing over the ironwood Elara had just secured. The copper-feathered rooster let out a shrill, desperate cry, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath, caught in the exact temperature of a pending tragedy. Then a sound emerged from the manor house, not a shout, but the heavy, definitive thud of the great library doors swinging open against the stone walls. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence that carried the weight of 5 years of unspoken grief, and a power that required no words to command the air. From the deep shadows of the west wing porch, a tall figure emerged into the pale morning light. Gideon Vane did not hurry. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that made the mud of the yard seem like a polished ballroom floor. He was dressed in a frock coat of charcoal wool, his cravat tied with a geometric precision that spoke of a man who found order in the smallest details. As he descended the limestone steps, the footmen froze, their hands dropping from the coupe as if the wood had suddenly turned to white-hot iron. Honoria's face went a sickly shade of grey, the charcoal velvet of her pelisse suddenly appearing too heavy for her frame. "Gideon, you should not be out here. The damp. The girl is being removed. It is a matter of the Thorne debt. I have the parchment right here." Gideon Vane did not look at his cousin. He walked past the gig, his gaze fixed entirely on the girl standing in the center of the ruined yard. He stopped between Elara Thorne and the footman, his presence a physical wall that Honoria's malice could not breach. He was a head taller than any man in the yard, his scarred face appearing like a landscape of quiet resilience in the weak sunlight. He reached out and took the grain satchel from the mud, his large, calloused hand brushing against the rough canvas as he set it upright with a gentleness that felt like a benediction. Then, he reached into the breast of his coat and produced a document of his own. It was not a common parchment. It was a heavy, vellum scroll bound with a ribbon of deep blue silk and sealed with the Vane signet in gold. He did not speak, but the way he held the document toward Lady Honoria was a declaration of absolute authority. He stepped toward the gig, his eyes locking onto Honoria's with a searching intensity that made her shrink back into the velvet cushions. Gideon unrolled the vellum just enough for Honoria to see the bold, rhythmic script within. It was a deed of purchase, a legal settlement in perpetuity. With a single, decisive movement of his finger, he traced the lines that proved he had personally purchased every single debt associated with the Thorne name. This included not just the recent arrears, but every annuity, every mortgage, and every phantom debt Silas Thorne had supposedly left behind. By the power of his own hand, he had cleared the Thorne ledger, rendering Honoria's eviction notice nothing more than a scrap of wasted paper. Honoria's breath hitched in her throat, a small, strangled sound of defeat. You bought the Thorne debt. Why? After what their family did. After the silence they cost you. Gideon did not answer her. He turned back to Elara, his gaze softening into something that held the steady, warm weight of a shared truth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger. Not the ironwood ledger, but a private volume of his own. He opened it to a page where he had been recording the morning tasks, the meticulously balanced accounts of a girl who fed chickens and mended roofs in a ruined sarcenet gown. He held the book out to her, and for a fleeting second, his fingers brushed against her calloused hand as she took it. The touch was as solid as stone and as warm as a hearth fire. He looked at the footman and gave a single, sharp gesture toward the manor. The men did not hesitate. They turned and fled toward the service entrance, their faces pale with the shock of seeing the silent Duke in the light. Honoria, realizing she had been utterly dismantled by the very man she sought to protect, signaled her driver with a frantic, trembling hand. The gig jerked forward, the wheels spraying mud across the yard as she retreated, leaving a trail of lavender water that was quickly swallowed by the smell of the damp earth and the birds. The yard was quiet once more, the only sound, the soft, rhythmic clucking of the chickens as they began to settle after the panic. Gideon Vane remained standing in the mud beside Elara, his charcoal coat splattered with the grey filth of the yard. Yet he had never looked more like a duke. He looked at the mended roof of the poultry house, then at the steel chisels peeking from Elara's pocket, and finally back at her face. He did not speak a word, but in the silence between them, the isolating barrier of the past was finally, irrevocably broken. Elara felt the weight of the ironwood ledger, safely hidden, and no longer a burden of shame, but the very foundation of the truth she had recovered. She looked at the silent Duke, her heart finally finding its steady, rhythmic beat. The silence was no longer a wall, but a shield. He had watched her mend his estate, and in doing so, he had allowed her to mend the bones of her own life. Where are you listening from tonight? And have you ever had someone stand by your side when you were at your most vulnerable? Tell me about a moment when a silent gesture meant more than 1,000 words in the comments below. The threshold of the West Wing Library was not merely a doorway, but a boundary between two distinct worlds, the muddy reality of survival and the gilded cage of intellectual isolation. As Elara Thorne stepped across the polished mahogany floorboards, her mud-splatter boots left a trail of grey, damp footprints upon the exquisite Persian carpet. She felt the weight of her stained sarcenet gown, the fabric rasping against her legs with a sound like dry leaves, a stark contrast to the heavy velvet draperies that muffled the world outside. The room was vast, the air filled with the scent of old parchment, cedar oil, and the lingering, clinical cold of a space that had not felt the warmth of a human voice in 5 years. Gideon Vane stood by the great arched window, his silhouette framed by the dying light of the afternoon, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture of profound, habitual restraint. Elara held the ironwood ledger against her chest, the heavy leather binding feeling like a piece of her father's heart she had finally recovered from the shadows. She waited in the exact center of the room, her breath steady, her gaze fixed on the Duke's broad shoulders. She did not feel the need to curtsy or apologize for the filth of the yard that she had brought into his sanctuary. She had mended his estate with those very hands, and her presence was the evidence of a labor he had witnessed every single day. The silence between them was not the empty, suffocating void of the manor's hallways. It was a silence filled with the rhythmic memory of the hammer hitting the nail and the grain falling from the satchel. "I have brought the records His Grace requires," Elara said, her voice sounding surprisingly clear in the hushed library. It was the first time she had spoken to him within the walls of the house, and the sound seemed to ripple through the stagnant air like a stone dropped into a deep, dark well. "The ironwood ledger documents the Thorne annuities and the true state of the Oakshott accounts. It proves that my father did not fail this house. He was the one who kept the foundation from crumbling, while the world chose to look elsewhere." Gideon Vane did not turn immediately. He remained motionless, his gaze likely fixed on the poultry yard below where the chickens were settling for the evening. When he finally moved, it was with a slow, deliberate gravity. He turned to face her, and for the first time, Elara saw the man without the distance of the library glass. His eyes were not cold, as the villagers claimed, but possessed a searching, weary intelligence that seemed to catalogue every inkstain and every callus on her hands. He stepped toward her, the sound of his boots on the wood a heavy, resonant heartbeat. He reached out, not for the ledger, but for a small silver-handled bell on the desk. He did not ring it. He simply touched the metal, as if confirming the reality of the physical world. "I watched you," Gideon said, and the sound of his voice was like the first crack of ice on a frozen river, low, rusty from disuse, yet carrying a resonance that vibrated in the very bones of the room. It was the first time he had spoken aloud to anyone but his closest servant in years, and the weight of the words seemed to cause the shadows in the corners of the library to retreat. "Every morning, when the mist was still thick enough to choke the breath, I watched you feed the birds. I watched you mend the fence with a stone when you had no tools, and I watched you save them during the storm, when the rest of this house was hiding beneath their blankets." He stopped a few paces from her, the scent of expensive tobacco and rain-washed wool clinging to him. "They told me the Thorne name was a legacy of ruin. They told me that silence was the only way to protect what remained of my own soul after the great frost. But your labor, your refusal to be invisible despite the gown they forced upon you." It was a sound louder than any shout. "You did not ask for my voice, Elara. You simply acted as if you already possessed the right to be seen." Elara looked down at the ledger, then back up at the Duke. "My father taught me that the bones of a house are not made of stone or silk, but of the integrity of the work performed within them. I did not work for your notice, Your Grace. I worked because the birds were hungry and the roof was broken. I worked because manual labor is the only thing the world cannot steal from a person who has lost everything else." Gideon reached out then, his long, scarred fingers grazing the leather of the ironwood ledger as he took it from her. He did not open it to check the figures. He held it with a reverence that acknowledged the weight of the truth it contained. Honoria saw a servant in a ruined dress. "I saw the only person at Oakshott who knew how to mend what was truly broken. You have mended more than a poultry house, Elara Thorne. You have mended the silence of this house." He set the ledger on his mahogany desk, the heavy thud of the book sounding like the closing of a chapter on a decade of grief. "The Thornes will be restored, not because of a duke's charity, but because you have already earned the foundation you stand upon." A fortnight later, the frost had finally begun to loosen its grip on the northern moors, replaced by the scent of damp moss and the first tentative promise of a pale spring sun. The poultry yard at Oakshott Manor had been transformed. The fences were straight and sturdy, the drainage was clear, and the birds moved with a vigorous, healthy energy that mirrored the restoration of the estate. Elara stood at the edge of the yard as the first light of dawn began to bleed into the horizon, her breath blooming in soft white plumes against the grey stone of the manor walls. She was no longer wearing the ink-stained sarcenet gown. She wore a simple dress of high-quality indigo wool, though her hands remained calloused and her spine was as straight as a plumb line. She reached for the heavy grain bucket, the wood smooth and well-oiled, but before she could lift it, a shadow fell across the damp earth. Gideon Vane stood beside her, his charcoal coat unbuttoned in the softening air. He did not speak. The silence between them was now a shared sanctuary rather than a wall, but he reached down and took the handle of the bucket from her. He did not offer to take over the task. He simply held the weight of it, standing as her partner in the morning ritual. Together, they moved through the yard. Elara scattered the premium oats in wide, rhythmic arcs, the golden grain catching the first rays of the rising sun. The Duke moved with her, his presence a steady, protective anchor in the morning light. The chickens flocked around them, a tapestry of copper and white feathers, their clucking a low, contented hum that filled the space where social cruelty had once lingered. High above, the library windows reflected the pink and gold of the sky, no longer unblinking eyes of a silent sentinel, but windows to a house that was finally breathing again. As the sun fully cleared the ridge, illuminating the limestone peaks with a blinding clarity, Gideon turned to Elara. He did not look at the manor or the vast acres of his inheritance. He looked at the girl who had taught him the value of being witnessed in one's simplest state. He reached out and covered her hand with his own as she reached for the last handful of grain. The texture of his skin was rough, a worker's hand hidden beneath a nobleman's sleeve. And in that touch, the last of the cold shadows of the Thorne legacy were finally burnt away. Every morning, Gideon said softly, his voice now a steady part of the world's music. Every morning, I will be here, not to watch from a window, but to stand in the light. Elara Thorne leaned her shoulder against his, the warmth of his presence a solid restorative force. She had spent a lifetime learning the quiet discipline of total invisibility, a cold draught in a room full of candles, a name whispered in shame. But now she stood in the ordinary light, fully and irrevocably seen. The poultry yard was no longer a place of penury. It was the cornerstone of a new life, built with her own hands and guarded by a man who required no further explanation. The loudest truths are often found in the quietest ledgers, and the strongest foundations are built by those who refuse to let the world break their spirit. In the high, elegant silence of Oakshott Manor, the broken pieces of their world were finally made whole, and the two survivors stood together, watching the sunrise over a world they had restored stone by stone and heart by heart. Where are you listening from tonight? And have you ever found that the peace of being truly seen was worth more than any inheritance? Tell me about the ruin in your life that you are currently mending in the comments below.